The sound comes first, a dull, heavy clang against the linoleum floor that cuts through the noise of the cafeteria. Every head turns at once, and for a moment, silence fills the room. Leo stands in the doorway, gripping the handle of an old rust-stained toolbox. The metal catches the light unevenly, its corners dented and clasps blackened with age. No one really knows where it came from, only that Leo never goes anywhere without it. To the boys of St. Jude's home, he isn't just another kid. He's the one with the box, and whatever's inside, no one dares to ask. He keeps his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the vats of lukewarm slop behind the serving counter. If you don't make eye contact, they sometimes lose interest. It's a rule of survival he's learned over the 7 years he's been here. But today the rule fails him. Kyle, a boy whose shoulders have recently broadened with a cruel sort of confidence, plants his foot in the aisle. Leo stops, the toolbox bumping against his leg. The weight of it is familiar, a dense, solid thing in a life that feels like mist. It's the only thing his father left him. Not a letter, not a photograph, not even a memory he can be sure is real, just this. This sarcophagus of secrets he can't open. Look what the garbage man dragged in, Kyle sneers, his voice carrying easily across the clatter of forks and plates. A few of his friends snicker. Still carrying your dad's lunchbox, Leo? What's inside today, huh? A whole lot of nothing, just like him? The words are meant to be knives, and they find their mark twisting in the hollow space where a family should be. Leo's knuckles turn white around the handle. He can feel the cold, pitted metal against his skin, a stark contrast to the hot flush of shame creeping up his neck. He imagines dropping it, just letting the weight crash to the floor and walking away. But he can't. His fingers won't obey. You are there in that moment. You feel the tremor in his hand, the desperate fight to keep his face a mask of indifference. The air smells of boiled potatoes and bleach, a scent that will forever be tied to humiliation. You can hear the low murmur of other conversations dying down, replaced by a focused, predatory silence. Everyone is watching the boy in his box. They see a freak, an oddity clinging to a piece of junk. They don't see the silent nightly ritual where Leo traces the faded, almost invisible initials etched below the handle. A.M. Arthur Morgan. A name that feels more like a ghost story than a father. He has whispered it into his pillow 1,000 times, trying to give it form, to make it real. Leave him alone, Kyle, a voice pipes up from a nearby table. It's Sarah, a girl from the sister home who helps serve lunch. Her cheeks are flushed with indignation. Kyle just laughs, a loud barking sound. What, you feel sorry for the orphan and his orphan box? Maybe there's a treasure map inside. Gonna lead you to a pile of scrap metal, right, Leo? He nudges the toolbox with the toe of his worn-out sneaker. The box doesn't move. It's too heavy, too solid. It feels anchored to the very center of the earth. For a wild, fleeting second, Leo wishes it would open up and swallow him whole, away from these fluorescent lights and jeering faces. He takes a deep breath, the institutional air feeling thin and useless in his lungs. He sidesteps Kyle without a word, his shoulder brushing the wall. The movement is slow, deliberate. He feels 100 pairs of eyes on his back as he walks toward the serving line. The toolbox bumps against his thigh with every step. Thump, 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 it's a heartbeat. Not his own, but something other. Something old and patient. He slides his tray along the metal runners, not seeing the food being slopped onto his plate. His mind is filled with the image of the lock on the front of the box. A single round lock, its keyhole a dark, gaping mouth. There was no key. Of all the things his father had failed to leave him, the key felt like the cruelest omission. He finds an empty table in the far corner, a small island of solitude. He places the toolbox on the bench beside him, not on the floor. It never touches the floor if he can help it. It feels like a betrayal. He stares at the rust patterns, seeing them not as decay but as a map of a forgotten country. Where had this box been? What had it seen? Had his father's hands gripped this same handle, his knuckles white with frustration or the thrill of creation? The questions are a constant, low hum in the back of his mind. They are the only inheritance he has, besides the box itself. He picks up his fork, but he doesn't eat. His appetite is a ghost, just like his father. He rests a hand on the cool metal surface of the box. It feels less like an object and more like a limb he was born with. A heavy, awkward piece of himself that he must learn to carry. The nights at St. Jude's are long, painted in shades of grey from the single security light that bleeds through the dormitory's grimy window. The sounds are a symphony of restless sleep, the creak of bed springs, a muffled cough, the soft whimpers of a younger boy dreaming of a home he barely remembers. For Leo, this is the time when the toolbox transforms. In the oppressive silence of the shared room, it ceases to be an object of ridicule and becomes a sacred text. He pulls it from under his bed, the metal cool and smooth against the rough wool of his blanket. He sets it on his lap, the weight a comforting pressure. He runs his fingers over the surface, a blind man reading a story written in dents and scratches. Each imperfection is a word, a sentence. There's the deep gouge near the left hinge. What? Tool slipped to make such a mark. There's the strange star-shaped pattern of discoloration on the lid, a chemical spill, a spark from a welding torch. He imagines a man with his own face, but older, with grease-stained hands and eyes that burned with a quiet intensity. He pictures him in a workshop filled with the smell of sawdust and hot metal, the air alive with the hum of machinery and the scratch of a pencil on drafting paper. These are not memories, but desperate constructions, built from the flimsy material of hope. Mrs. Gable, the home's director, had called him into her office last week. Her office always smelled of stale coffee and disappointment. She sat behind a large, imposing oak desk, her fingers steepled. The toolbox was on the floor beside his chair, a silent defendant in a trial he was destined to lose. "Leo," she began, her voice devoid of warmth, "we need to talk about that." She gestured towards it with a flick of her wrist. "It's becoming a distraction. The other boys are teasing you, and you're isolating yourself. It's not healthy to be so attached to an inanimate object." He had stared at the worn rug, tracing the faded floral patterns with his eyes. "It's all I have of him," he'd whispered, the words feeling small and fragile in the cavernous silence of the room. Mrs. Gable had sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "I understand that, dear, but your father, he was not a man to be emulated. He left you with nothing but a box of junk." Her words were meant to be a kindness, a sharp but necessary surgery to sever a painful tie, but all they did was pour salt on a wound he didn't know how to show her. How could he explain that this box of junk felt more real, more present, than any living person in this place? You're there, in that cold office. You see the boy flinch as if struck. You see the rigid set of his jaw, the battle being waged behind his eyes. To you it isn't just a box. You can almost feel the phantom vibrations of the machinery it once lay beside. You can smell the ghost of solder and oil clinging to its rusted surface. It's a time capsule, a message in a bottle from a man who was, for reasons unknown, cast away from his own son's life. Mrs. Gable only sees a problem to be managed, a deviation from the norm. You see a boy trying to hold on to the last piece of a puzzle he is a part of, even if he doesn't know what the final picture is supposed to look like. Back in the dormitory, under the weak moonlight, Leo presses his ear against the cold lid of the toolbox. He holds his breath, listening. He knows it's foolish. He knows there's nothing to hear but the dull thud of his own heart. But sometimes, if he concentrates hard enough, he can almost imagine it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, a low, resonant hum. The echo of a workshop, the ghost of a creator at work. He traces the initials again. A. M. Arthur Morgan. He tries to say the name Dad, but the word catches in his throat, a foreign shape his mouth has forgotten how to make. He wonders what his father's voice sounded like. Was it deep and steady? Or was it quick and excited, stumbling over itself to get an idea out? The mockery in the cafeteria was a constant, but the silence of the dormitory is where the real ache lives. The other boys have faded photographs tucked under their pillows. They have stories, real or imagined, of mothers with soft hands and fathers who taught them to throw a ball. Leo has this, a cold, unyielding box. He often dreams of it. In the dreams, it's not heavy. It floats just an inch off the ground, and he follows it through winding corridors and down endless staircases, always chasing, never catching up. In other dreams, it's filled with water and he's drowning in it, the iron scent of the rust filling his lungs. Tonight, he doesn't dream. He just sits there, cross-legged on his cot, his hand resting on the toolbox, a silent vigil for a man he never knew, but whose legacy he carries with every aching step. The weight is his burden, but it is also his proof that Arthur Morgan existed. and proof, therefore, that so did he. The obsession began on a Tuesday. It started as a flicker of defiance and spiraled into a consuming fire. After another day of sidelong glances and whispered jokes, Leo carried the toolbox not to the dormitory, but to the forgotten corner of the St. Jude's grounds, the old dilapidated workshop. The building had been condemned for years, its windows boarded up, its door chained and padlocked, but a small ground-level window at the back had its plywood warped by years of rain. It was just loose enough for a skinny teenage boy to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of forgotten projects. The smell of decaying wood, dust, and damp earth filled his nostrils. Moonlight struggled through the grimy panes of a high window, illuminating a graveyard of rusted tools and half-finished birdhouses from a long-abandoned shop class. It was a sad, neglected place, but to Leo it felt like a sanctuary. Here the toolbox didn't seem out of place. It belonged. He set it down on a sturdy, dust-covered workbench, the thud echoing in the cavernous space. For the first time it felt like he had brought it home. His focus narrowed to the lock. It was a simple-looking brass disc, now a mottled green-brown with age. The keyhole was a perfect dark circle, a tiny portal to another world. He had never truly tried to open it before. The thought of it being empty was more terrifying than the thought of it remaining locked forever. An empty box would mean Mrs. Gable was right. It would mean his father had left him not a mystery, but a cruel joke. Tonight, though, the fear was eclipsed by a burning, desperate need to know. He would face the emptiness if he had to, but he could not bear the not knowing for another day. He started with the tools scattered around the old workshop. He found a bent nail and a piece of stiff wire. For over an hour he worked under the pale moonlight, his breath fogging in the cold air. He probed the tiny keyhole, trying to feel for the tumblers, mimicking scenes he'd watched in movies. His fingers, clumsy and unaccustomed to such delicate work, fumbled. The wire bent. The nail head snapped off. The lock remained stubbornly, defiantly sealed. Frustration began to build, a hot, tight knot in his chest. It felt like the box was mocking him, just like the other boys. It was holding its secrets just out of reach, guarding the history of a man who had already guarded himself from his own son. You are his frustration. You are the scraped knuckle and the metallic taste of blood in his mouth. You feel the grit of the dust under his fingernails, the maddeningly smooth surface of the lock that offers no purchase. You understand this isn't just about opening a box. This is about breaking through a wall that has stood between him and his past his entire life. Every failed attempt, every rasp of metal on metal that yields nothing, is another confirmation of his father's absence. The lock is a symbol of every closed door, every unanswered question, every night spent wondering why. Why did you leave? Why did you leave me this? Giving up on the wire, he grew reckless. He found a heavy ball-peen hammer, its wooden handle smooth from the hands of countless boys before him. He lifted it, its weight feeling immense in the charged silence. He thought of Kyle's sneering face. He thought of Mrs. Gable's pitying eyes. He thought of 7 years of being the boy with the box. A guttural cry ripped from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish, and he brought the hammer down. The blow landed not on the lock, but just beside it. The clang was deafening, a shriek of tortured metal that seemed to shake the very foundations of the workshop. He struck it again and again, his movements frantic, fueled by years of pent-up sorrow and rage. He hammered until his arm ached, until sweat stung his eyes, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The lid of the toolbox was now horribly misshapen, a landscape of fresh, gleaming dents surrounding the lock. But the lock itself, the small round circle of brass, was untouched. It was as if it existed in a protected space, impervious to his fury. He dropped the hammer, its clatter on the concrete floor sounding final. He slumped against the workbench, defeated. He had thrown all his pain at the box, and it had thrown it right back at him. He slid to the floor, his back against the leg of the bench, and finally let the tears come. They were hot and silent, carving clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't crying for the unopened box. He was crying for the boy who had no other way to talk to his father than to scream at a piece of metal in a dark, abandoned room. He sat there for what felt like hours, the cold of the concrete seeping into his bones. The moon had moved across the sky, its light now falling on a different part of the room. As his sobs subsided, replaced by a hollow exhaustion, he looked at the toolbox. The violence had changed nothing. It was still locked, still silent. But as he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, he noticed something. The final desperate hammer blow had chipped away a thick flake of rust right near the main handle. And underneath, where the raw steel was now exposed, was a seam. A tiny, almost invisible line that didn't belong. It wasn't a crack from the damage. It was too perfect, too straight. It looked intentional, a new kind of energy. A fragile flicker of hope began to push back the despair. He had been trying to break down the front door when maybe, just maybe, there was another way in. The seam was his new obsession. It was a hairline fracture in his reality, a whisper of possibility in a world that had always been brutally, unyieldingly solid. Back in the oppressive quiet of the dormitory, long after the other boys had fallen into their troubled sleep, Leo worked. He used the edge of a stolen butter knife from the cafeteria, its tip painstakingly sharpened against the concrete windowsill. The work was slow, agonizingly so. He had to be silent, his movements small and precise, his breathing shallow. The slightest scrape of metal on metal sounded like a gunshot in the still night air. He traced the seam. It ran from the base of the handle, down the front of the toolbox, and disappeared under the thick, folded lip of the lid. It wasn't a flaw. It was a design, a hidden panel. His father hadn't left him a box with a missing key. He had left him a puzzle. The realization sent a jolt through him, a current of understanding that was both thrilling and terrifying. This wasn't a simple container. It was a test, a message that could only be received by someone patient enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to look beyond the obvious. His father wasn't a man of simple locks and keys. He was a man of secrets. For 3 nights he worked, his sleep schedule dissolving, his exhaustion masked by a feverish determination. He learned the geography of the toolbox's surface by touch alone, his fingers mapping every ridge and valley in the dark. On the 4th night, the tip of the knife finally found purchase. It slipped into the seam with a soft, satisfying click. It was a sound no one else in the world heard, but for Leo it was a thunderclap. He held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gently, carefully pried upwards. The metal groaned in protest, the sound of rust and time giving way. The false front, a thin sheet of steel artfully disguised as part of the main body, lifted away. Behind it, there was no cavernous opening. Instead, there was a shallow, recessed compartment, no deeper than his thumb. And nestled inside, against a bed of what looked like faded, oil-stained velvet, lay 2 objects. The first was a key. It was unlike any key he had ever seen. It was flat and complex, more like a piece of a clock's internal mechanism than a simple key. It was cut with intricate gears and notches, a thing of strange industrial beauty. The second object was a small brass plaque, no bigger than his palm. Engraved on its surface in elegant looping script were the words, "The first step is to see the world differently." You are there, sharing his breathless silence. The moonlight catches the strange angles of the key, making it glint like a captured star. The engraved words seem to shimmer, speaking directly to him from across the chasm of years. This is the moment, the culmination of all the ridicule, all the lonely nights, all the violent frustration. It's a vindication. His belief, his irrational, childish faith in this rusty box was not misplaced. It wasn't just a box. It was a promise, and his father, the ghost, the enigma, was not a man who left nothing. He was a man who left everything, but he had hidden it in plain sight. With a trembling hand, Leo picked up the gear-toothed key. It felt warm, as if it held a residual spark of the man who had crafted it. He turned his attention back to the main lock, the one he had tried to smash into submission. He saw it now with new eyes. It wasn't just a keyhole. He noticed a tiny, almost invisible slot just to the side of it, a slot that perfectly matched the flat profile of the strange key. He inserted it. It slid in with a smooth, oiled precision that defied the box's rusty exterior. He turned it. There was no grinding sound, no resistance. Instead, a series of soft internal clicks, like a combination lock finding its sequence. Click, whir, clack. The 2 main latches on the front of the toolbox sprang open simultaneously with a sharp, definitive snap. The sound was loud in the sleeping dormitory, and Leo froze, his eyes darting towards the other beds. But no one stirred. It was as if the sound had existed only for him. He slowly, reverently lifted the lid. The hinges, which he had assumed were rusted solid, moved with a surprising, silent grace. The air that escaped from within was cool and dry, carrying a scent he couldn't quite place. The smell of old paper, a faint trace of ozone and something else, something clean and metallic like a scientist's laboratory. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw the contents. It wasn't filled with tools. Not hammers or wrenches, anyway. It was packed to the brim with scrolls of hand-drawn blueprints, rolled tightly and tied with twine. There were dozens of them. Beneath them, nestled in carefully cut-out foam, were strange, intricate objects made of brass and copper wire, things that looked like a cross between navigational instruments and pieces of jewelry. And on the very top, lying open, was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the same elegant, sloping handwriting as the plaque. He gently lifted it out. The first page contained not words, but a meticulously drawn map of a place he'd never seen, with a single point circled in red ink. Beside it, a set of coordinates. The legacy wasn't the box. The box was just the key. This was the inheritance. The journal became his entire world. During the day, it remained hidden, tucked away with the blueprints inside the newly resealed toolbox, which now sat under his bed with an air of quiet triumph. But at night, while St. Jude slept, Leo became an archaeologist of his own history, unearthing the fossilized thoughts of his father. He would retreat to the abandoned workshop, the one place he felt truly alone, and read by the weak beam of a stolen flashlight. The journal wasn't a diary of feelings or daily events. It was a logbook of creation. The pages were a universe of ideas. They were filled with dense cryptic notes, complex mathematical formulas, and sketches of impossible machines. One page detailed the mechanics of a clock that didn't tell time, but was designed to project faint, shimmering images of past events that had occurred in the room where it was placed. Another showed a small metallic bird that could mimic the song of any species after hearing it just once, its voice box made of finely tuned crystal filaments. It was the work of a genius, a dreamer, a man who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. Arthur Morgan wasn't just a mechanic or an engineer. He was a poet whose verses were written in brass and steel. Leo traced the handwriting with his finger, the elegant loops and sharp, decisive strokes. He could feel the passion in the frantic scribbles that filled the margins, the joy in the perfectly rendered diagrams. He was getting to know his father, not through shared memories, but through the landscape of his mind. He learned that Arthur had a fascination with acoustics and resonance, that he believed memories could leave a physical imprint on the world, and that he was obsessed with the idea of creating things that were not just functional but beautiful, things that inspired wonder. He was a man who built not for profit or fame, but for the sheer unadulterated love of invention. And as he read, a profound sadness began to mingle with his awe. This brilliant, vibrant mind, this man who could imagine a clock that held memories, why would he abandon his own son? The question was a constant, painful counterpoint to the symphony of creation he was discovering. There were no mentions of a wife, no mentions of a child. It was as if his father's personal life had been surgically removed from the record, leaving only the work. It was both a gift and a curse. Leo was being handed the keys to his father's kingdom, but he was still locked out of his heart. You sit with him in the cold, dusty workshop. You feel the rough, brittle texture of the old paper under his fingertips. You see the focused intensity in his eyes as he deciphers a particularly complex schematic, his lips moving silently as he works through the logic. You are a witness to this strange, posthumous meeting between father and son. You can see the boy's shoulders straighten, his posture changing. The shame he once carried is slowly being replaced by a burgeoning sense of pride. He is not the son of a man who left nothing. He is the son of Arthur Morgan, the invisible architect, the silent musician of gears and wires. He turned his attention to the blueprints. He unrolled them carefully on the workbench, the paper crackling in protest. They were magnificent. Each one was a work of art, drawn with an architect's precision and an artist's flair. There were schematics for a luminocular, a pair of binoculars that didn't magnify distance, but allowed the user to see the residual heat signatures of living things that had recently passed by. There were plans for a kinetic scribe, a pen that would write on its own, powered by the subtle vibrations of the earth. But one set of blueprints was larger and more detailed than all the others. It was labeled simply, "The Workshop." It showed the cross-section of a massive, hidden structure built into the bedrock behind a waterfall. There were multiple levels, rooms filled with strange and wonderful machinery, and a power source that seemed to draw energy directly from the flowing water. It was a masterpiece of hidden engineering, a secret world. And on the corner of this master blueprint, he saw them again, the same coordinates from the first page of the journal. Below them was a hand-drawn map. He recognized the landmarks instantly, not from his own life, but from the geography lessons he'd been forced to sit through. It was a town called Greylock, about 100 miles north, an old forgotten mill town nestled in a valley by a river. The red circle on the map was positioned over a place labeled Greylock Falls. A plan began to form in his mind, a wild, terrifying, and exhilarating idea. Mrs. Gable saw his father as a failure, a ghost who had abandoned him. The world saw Leo as the sad little orphan with a rusty box. But his father had not abandoned him. He had left him a map. He had left him a destination. He had left him a key to a world no one else knew existed. He wasn't meant to stay at St. Jude's, to grow up and get a factory job, to let his father's legacy rot in a box under his bed. He was meant to follow the map. He was meant to find the workshop. He carefully rolled the blueprints, his movements now filled with a sense of purpose he had never known. He was no longer just the keeper of the box. He was the inheritor of a dream. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was going. Leaving St. Jude's was like shedding a skin he'd worn for too long. It was an act of quiet rebellion, performed in the pre-dawn greyness when the only sounds were the distant hum of the kitchen freezers and the sighing of the wind in the eaves. Leo didn't pack much. A change of clothes, the small roll of cash he'd saved from odd jobs, and a few stale biscuits stuffed into a threadbare backpack. The journal was tucked securely in an inner pocket, its leather cover pressed against his heart. The toolbox, his constant companion, was his main piece of luggage. It felt different now, less like a burden, and more like an anchor of purpose. Its weight was no longer a drag but a ballast, keeping him steady against the uncertain currents ahead. He slipped through the squeaking side door of the dormitory, a ghost leaving a house of ghosts. Every step away from the red brick building felt like a step toward his real life. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of rain. He walked the 2 miles to the bus station, the toolbox bumping against his leg, a familiar rhythmic percussion. This time, however, it didn't sound like a heartbeat of the past. It sounded like the drumbeat of his future. He didn't look back. There was nothing to look back to. St. Jude's wasn't a home. It was a waiting room, and he was tired of waiting. The bus station was a small, desolate place, lit by the buzzing neon of a flickering sign. He bought a one-way ticket to Greylock with trembling hands, the woman behind the thick glass barely glancing at him. To her, he was just another runaway, a flicker of teenage angst passing through. She didn't see the blueprints in his mind, the secret kingdom he was seeking. He sat on a cold plastic bench, the toolbox placed carefully beside him, and waited. When the bus finally arrived, its brakes hissing like a tired beast, he felt a pang of fear. This was it. The point of no return. You're on that bus with him. You feel the lurch of the engine as it pulls away from the curb. The final definitive separation from the only life he's ever known. You see the familiar drab streets of his town slide by the window, buildings he's seen 1,000 times now, looking like sets from a movie about someone else's life. The other passengers are a blur of sleepy, anonymous faces. No one pays him any mind. He is utterly, completely alone, and yet, for the first time, he doesn't feel lonely. He feels directed. He pulls the journal from his pocket, not to read, but just to hold. It's a tangible link to the man who set him on this path. The journey took 4 hours. The landscape outside the window transformed slowly. The tired suburbs gave way to rolling farmland, then to dense, moody forests. The sky, which had been a pale, hopeful grey, deepened into a bruised purple, and a steady drizzle began to streak the windows. Leo watched the droplets race each other down the glass, each one a separate, frantic journey. He was one of those droplets detached from the cloud, on a collision course with a new world. He thought about his father making this same journey, Had he been excited, scared? Had he known he was leaving a part of himself behind? A son who would one day follow his trail of breadcrumbs? When the bus finally pulled into Greylock, the town seemed to be half drowned in mist. It was a place that time had forgotten. The main street was lined with brick buildings whose facades were crumbling, their windows dark and vacant. A few shops were still open, a dreary-looking diner, a hardware store, a pawn shop, but they seemed to be clinging to life by a thread. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine from the thick forests that crowded the town on all sides. It was a place of endings, not beginnings. But for Leo, it was the X on the map. This was the place. He stepped off the bus, the toolbox feeling heavier in the damp, heavy air. The bus pulled away with another hiss of its brakes, leaving him in a profound and sudden silence, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from an awning. He looked at the map he had memorized from the journal. Greylock Falls was about a mile out of town, upriver. He adjusted the backpack on his shoulders, gripped the handle of the toolbox and started walking. The pavement soon gave way to a muddy, overgrown path that followed the churning grey-green water of the river. The sound grew louder as he walked, a low rumble that vibrated through the soles of his shoes. It grew from a hum to a roar, a display of raw, untamed power, and then he saw it. Through a break in the trees, Greylock Falls. It wasn't a gentle, picturesque cascade. It was a violent, thundering curtain of water, crashing down over a sheer cliff face of dark, glistening rock. The spray from the falls created a perpetual mist that clung to the trees, making the whole area feel ethereal and otherworldly. According to the blueprint, the workshop wasn't just near the falls, it was behind them. He stood there, soaked by the spray, the roar of the water filling his ears, and stared at the seemingly impenetrable wall of nature. The map had led him here. Now he had to find the door. The base of the falls was a chaotic, treacherous place. The ground was a slick, muddy soup of earth and loose rock, and the air was so thick with water vapor, it was hard to breathe. The roar was deafening, a physical presence that hammered against his chest and made it impossible to think. Leo felt impossibly small, a trespasser in a place of raw elemental power. He clutched the toolbox, its familiar weight a small point of stability in the swirling chaos. He consulted the blueprint in his mind, the image seared into his memory. The entrance was supposed to be on the right side of the falls, about 20 feet up from the riverbank, hidden behind a curtain of ivy and rockfall. He began to climb, his sneakers slipping on the moss-covered rocks. He had to use one hand to steady himself, while the other clutched the handle of the toolbox, his knuckles white. Every step was a risk. A slip would mean a nasty fall into the churning pool at the base of the waterfall, where the current would be merciless. He focused on the details of the blueprint, a distinctive triangular-shaped boulder, a lightning-scarred pine tree leaning at a 45-degree angle. He was navigating not by sight, but by his father's instructions sent across time. It was a conversation held in geology and engineering. He found the lightning-scarred pine, its bark pale and smooth where the bolt had stripped it away, and just beyond it, half hidden by a tangle of dark green ivy, was the triangular boulder. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic rhythm against the steady, deep roar of the falls. This was the spot. He pushed aside the thick, wet leaves of the ivy, their undersides cold and slimy. At first, all he saw was more dark, wet rock. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through his excitement. Had he come all this way for nothing? Was it all a fantasy, the ramblings of a man who had lost his mind? But the blueprint had been specific. The door is not a door. It is a shadow that fits a key. He ran his hands over the rock face, his fingers searching, desperate. The stone was cold, rough and unyielding. And then his fingers found it. A perfect rectangular outline, so skillfully cut and weathered that it was nearly invisible, perfectly flush with the surrounding rock. It was a masterpiece of camouflage. There was no handle, no hinges, no sign of a lock. It was just a seamless, solid piece of the cliff face. He pressed against it, throwing his full weight into it. Nothing. It was as immovable as the mountain itself. You are there with him, feeling the damp chill of the rock under his palms. The roar of the water is a physical wall of sound, isolating him from the rest of the world. You feel his hope begin to curdle into despair. He has followed the map. He has solved the puzzle of the box. He has made the journey. And now he is faced with a literal stone wall. Is this the final, cruelest joke, to lead him to the treasure and then deny him entry? to show him the promised land from behind a locked gate. You see the slump of his shoulders, the exhaustion of the journey finally catching up with him. He sank to his knees, his energy spent. The toolbox rested in the mud beside him. He stared at it, at the familiar rust and dents. He had been so focused on finding the door, on following the map, that he had forgotten the first lesson his father had taught him, the one engraved on the brass plaque. The first step is to see the world differently. He had been trying to open the door like any other door. He had been pushing. What if that was the wrong way to see it? He looked at the strange, gear-toothed key from the toolbox's secret compartment, which he had tucked into his pocket for safekeeping. It was too small for a door this massive. It made no sense. His eyes fell upon the lock on the toolbox itself, the intricate circular mechanism he had nearly destroyed. His father had built a lock that required a special key, a lock that was a puzzle. Why would the door to his entire world be any less complex? He looked back at the stone wall, at the faint rectangular outline. He saw it with new eyes. He wasn't looking for a keyhole. He was looking for a lock. He began to search the perimeter of the stone door again, this time not for a hole but for a shape. His fingers traced the edges, feeling for any imperfection, any deviation. And then he found it. Near the bottom right corner, at about waist height, was a small circular indentation in the rock, no bigger than his palm. It was so weathered and filled with moss that it looked like a natural part of the stone. But as he scraped the moss away with his fingernail, he revealed a pattern, a series of concentric circles and notches carved into the stone. It wasn't a keyhole. It was a receptacle, a docking point. He looked from the circular pattern on the rock to the circular lock on his toolbox. They were a perfect match. The toolbox wasn't just the container for the map. The toolbox was the final key. With a surge of adrenaline, he lifted the heavy box. This was the moment of truth. He lined up the lock on its front with the indentation on the rock door and pushed. It slid into place with a deep, resonant, grinding thunk. The moment the toolbox clicked into place, the world changed. The roar of the waterfall, which had been an all-encompassing, chaotic force, suddenly seemed to focus. A deep harmonic hum resonated from the stone door, a vibration that traveled up Leo's arms and into his chest. It felt like the mountain itself was waking from a long slumber. He watched, mesmerized, as the carved notches on the toolbox lock began to glow with a soft blue-white light. The light spread, tracing the concentric circles in the stone receptacle, then shooting up and around the rectangular outline of the door. It was no longer a shadow in the rock. It was a gate of pure light. With a sound like the world's largest gears grinding into place, a sound that seemed to come from the very bedrock beneath his feet, the stone door did not swing open. It retracted. It slid silently and smoothly back into the cliff face, disappearing into a darkness that seemed absolute. The air that billowed out was ancient and still, carrying the scent of cool stone machine oil and a strange electric tang of ozone. It was the smell of a place sealed off from time, a chamber where the air itself had been waiting. The roar of the falls was now slightly muffled, a backdrop to the profound and inviting silence that lay beyond the threshold. Leo stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He pulled the toolbox from its receptacle. The light faded, but the door remained open. It was an invitation. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, crossing from the wild, wet, chaotic world outside into the still, controlled, secret world his father had built. The stone door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss and a final, definitive thud, plunging him into complete and utter darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He was trapped, alone in the dark, buried inside a mountain. But then another sound, a soft, rhythmic click-clack like a mechanical heart starting to beat. A line of small recessed lights flickered on along the floor, illuminating a long, downward-sloping corridor carved from the living rock. The light was soft, warm and steady. It wasn't a trap. It was a welcome. He followed the path of lights, his footsteps echoing in the immense silence. The toolbox felt both heavy and light in his hand. Its purpose served, yet its presence still essential. It was the relic that had brought him to the holy place. The corridor opened into a vast, circular chamber, and Leo stopped, his breath catching in his throat. It was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. The room was immense, at least 3 stories high, with a domed ceiling from which hung a colossal, intricate orrery made of brass and copper. Models of planets and moons, crafted with exquisite detail, hung suspended in the air, their orbits tracked by a complex system of silent, interlocking gears. The walls were not bare rock. They were lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves, crammed with books, rolled-up blueprints, and countless jars containing strange mechanical components and rare minerals that seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. You are standing beside him, your senses overwhelmed. You see the dust motes dancing in the beams of soft ambient light that seem to emanate from the very walls. You smell the clean, crisp scent of old paper, cedarwood, and cool metal. You hear the gentle, almost imperceptible whirring of 100 different machines, all operating in a state of suspended animation, a silent symphony of potential energy. This is not a workshop. It is a cathedral dedicated to the art of invention. It is a testament to one man's singular, brilliant vision. In the center of the room, on a massive circular workbench, lay a half-finished project, its wires and gears exposed, tools laid out beside it, as if the craftsman had just stepped away for a moment. Leo walked deeper into the room, his head tilted back in awe as he stared at the celestial dance of the orrery above. He ran his hand along the spine of a massive leather-bound book titled Principles of Acoustic Resonance. He touched the cool, smooth surface of a workbench made from a single massive slab of polished oak. Everything was clean, organized, and preserved under a thin, uniform layer of dust. It was a time capsule. A life paused. He saw dozens of his father's inventions, some of which he recognized from the blueprints, sitting on display stands. The luminocular, the kinetic scribe, the memory clock. They weren't just drawings. They were real. He felt a sense of profound and overwhelming connection. Every object in this room was a piece of his father's soul. Every gear, every wire, every carefully written note was a word in the story of his life. Leo wasn't just in his father's workshop. He was inside his father's mind. And in this vast, magnificent space, there was no sense of abandonment. Only purpose. Only passion. He set the rusty toolbox down on the central workbench, right beside the half-finished invention. It looked small and humble in the grandness of the workshop, but it didn't look out of place. It was the key that had opened the door, the first note in this incredible hidden symphony. He was home. Days bled into one another in the timeless sanctuary of the workshop. The world outside, with its rain and sun, its clocks and schedules, ceased to exist. The only time that mattered was the steady, rhythmic pulse of the machinery that powered this hidden world. Leo discovered the workshop was a self-sustaining ecosystem. The energy from the falls was harnessed by a massive, silent water turbine deep in the mountain's core, providing light and power. Vents, cleverly disguised on the cliff face, circulated fresh air. There were even small automated hydroponic gardens in a side chamber, providing a Spartan but steady supply of edible greens. His father had thought of everything. Leo explored every corner of the workshop, his initial awe slowly transforming into a deep, studious reverence. He spent hours in the library, poring over his father's books on physics, metallurgy, and arcane engineering principles. He read his father's journal from cover to cover, then read it again, the complex theories and wild ideas starting to coalesce in his mind. He was not just a visitor here. He was becoming a student. He was learning his father's language, the language of gears and circuits, of wonder and logic. He was drawn again and again to one particular invention that sat on a pedestal in a quiet alcove. It was the memory clock, the chronovisor, as his father had named it in the journal. It was a beautiful, intricate device, about 2 feet tall. It was a complex lattice of brass rings, spinning gyroscopes and finely ground lenses, all arranged around a central, multifaceted crystal that pulsed with a soft, internal light. According to the journal, it didn't show the past like a movie. Instead, it captured and replayed emotional resonance, the faint psychic echoes left behind by strong moments of human feeling. His father had theorized that powerful emotions could alter a space on a quantum level, and this device was designed to read those alterations. Leo felt a deep, trembling hesitation to activate it. What if it showed him something he wasn't ready to see? What if it showed him his father's loneliness, his pain? What if in this whole magnificent workshop, the only emotion it had recorded was sadness? The fear of that knowledge was a barrier, but the desire to see, to know, to connect with the man who had built this place was stronger. He found the activation sequence in the journal, a complex series of adjustments to the lenses and the power conduits. You watch as he approaches the device, his hands shaking slightly. You feel his apprehension, the mix of hope and dread that churns within him. This machine is a direct line to the heart of the man he never knew. It is more intimate than a letter, more honest than a photograph. It promises to show him the truth of this place, the feelings that were poured into its creation. You can almost hear the ghost of his father whispering the instructions, guiding his son's hands as he prepares to bridge the gap between them, the gap of time and silence. Following the notes, he gently spun the largest brass ring until a low hum emanated from the central crystal. He adjusted a series of lenses, focusing a beam of the workshop's soft light through the crystal and onto the empty wall of the alcove. He then turned a small calibrated dial at the base of the machine, the dial that, according to the journal, tuned the device to specific emotional frequencies. He didn't know what to look for, so he turned it slowly, sweeping through the spectrum. For a long time, nothing happened. The wall remained blank. Disappointment began to creep in. Perhaps it was just another beautiful, failed dream. He was about to turn it off when he saw it. A faint shimmer on the stone wall, like heat haze rising from a summer road. He held his breath and fine-tuned the dial. The shimmer coalesced. It wasn't a clear image, but a shifting, translucent tableau of light and shadow. A figure began to take shape. A tall, lean man with a shock of unruly dark hair, the same hair Leo saw in his own reflection. It was his father, Arthur Morgan. He was younger, his face etched with concentration, not sadness. He was hunched over the central workbench, his hands moving with a blur of focused energy as he worked on the great orrery that now hung from the ceiling. There was no sound, but Leo could feel the emotion radiating from the image. It was an overwhelming, pure, unadulterated joy. It was the fierce, vibrant passion of a creator, completely lost in his work. He saw his father solder a delicate joint, then step back, his head cocked to the side, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face as a piece of the puzzle slotted perfectly into place. The chronovisor wasn't showing him a memory. It was showing him the feeling of a memory, and the feeling was not loneliness. It was bliss. It was purpose. It was love. A deep, profound love for the act of creation itself. Leo watched for hours as the shimmering ghost of his father worked, his heart aching with a strange mix of sorrow and happiness. He had missed this. He had missed all of it, but he was also a witness to it now. The machine was a gift. It allowed him to see his father, not as the man who left, but as the man who was. A man consumed by a beautiful, brilliant fire. As the projection finally faded, leaving the wall blank once more, Leo reached out and touched the warm crystal of the chronovisor. He wasn't just the son of an inventor anymore. He was the keeper of his joy. And for the first time, he felt the crushing weight of his own loneliness begin ever so slightly to lift. The discovery of the chronovisor changed the tenor of Leo's existence in the workshop. It became his ritual. Each day he would tune the machine, not searching for new memories, but re-watching the one he had found, the ghost of his father lost in the rapture of his work. It was a comforting presence, a silent companionship that filled the vast, quiet space. He started to feel less like an intruder and more like an apprentice, observing the master at his craft. He began to study the half-finished invention on the central workbench, cross-referencing it with blueprints and notes he found in the library. Trying to understand its purpose, he learned it was intended to be Arthur's masterpiece, a resonance tuner. According to the scrawled, excited notes, it was designed to amplify the ambient energy of the Earth, subtle vibrations, geothermal currents, the planet's magnetic field, and convert it into a clean, limitless source of power. It was a wildly ambitious, world-changing idea. And it was unfinished. The central power conduit was disconnected, the final crystalline array uncalibrated. His father had been on the cusp of a breakthrough when, for some reason, he had simply stopped. The question of why returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Why build a paradise only to abandon it on the verge of its greatest triumph? One afternoon, while searching for a specific schematic for the resonance tuner, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the base of the massive oak workbench. It was a false panel, much like the one on the toolbox, a testament to his father's love of clever concealment. Inside there was no invention, no blueprint. There was only a single, small antique audio recorder, the kind that used delicate wax cylinders, and a small, carefully labeled box of those cylinders. The label on the recorder itself read simply, "For Leo, his blood ran cold." This was different from the journal, different from the chronovisor. This was not an observation of his father's work. This was a direct address, a message sent across the void, intended only for him. His hand trembled as he lifted the recorder. It was a beautiful object, made of polished mahogany and brass, but it felt as heavy as a tombstone. He found the cylinder labeled 1, and following the etched instructions on the machine, carefully placed it onto the spindle. He wound the crank, the soft clicking of the mechanism, an unnervingly loud sound in the silent workshop. He took a deep, shuddering breath and flipped the switch. A hiss of static filled the air, the sound of empty time. And then a voice he had tried to imagine 1,000 times, but could never have captured. It was warm and clear, with a slight thoughtful rasp. It was the voice of the man in the light show memories, the voice of the elegant handwriting, the voice of his father. And it spoke his name. "Leo," the voice said. And the sound of it, the simple paternal utterance of his own name, broke something inside him. "If you are hearing this, it means you found the box. It means you were patient. It means you were clever. It means you are your father's son. I am so proud of you. You are listening with him. You feel the wave of emotion that washes over the boy, so powerful it makes his knees weak. Tears stream down his face, but he makes no sound, afraid to miss a single precious word. This is the moment he has unknowingly waited for his entire life. The confirmation, the acknowledgement, the love spoken and preserved in wax. You hear the weariness in Arthur's voice, but also a deep, resonant affection that transcends the static of the recording. "I have to be brief," the voice continued, a new urgency in its tone. "I know you have questions. I know you must hate me. I need you to understand. I didn't leave you because I wanted to. I built this place for us, a world of our own, away from the noise and greed where we could build and dream together. But my work, it attracted the wrong kind of attention. Men in suits, from a corporation called Axiom Dynamics, they didn't see wonder in my inventions. They saw weapons. They saw profit. They wanted to turn my resonance tuner into a cudgel to hold over the world." The story poured out of the recorder, a torrent of confession and regret. Axiom had tried to recruit him. He had refused. They had threatened him. He had hidden his work. But then they had found out about Leo. They had threatened his son. They knew I would never give them my work. Arthur's voice cracked with an emotion Leo couldn't decipher. Was it fear or rage? But they also knew I would give them anything to keep you safe. And so I made a deal. I would disappear. I would stop my work. I would turn myself into a ghost, a failed eccentric who abandoned his family. And in exchange, they would leave you alone, let you grow up in peace, anonymous and safe in the system. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to build, a life without you in it. I left you the toolbox, a simple, ugly thing no one would ever look at twice. It was my only hope, my bet that the part of me that is in you, the curiosity, the stubbornness, the spark, would one day lead you back here, back to our home. Everything in this workshop, Leo, everything I have ever built, it is all for you. It is your legacy, your birthright. I am so sorry I couldn't give it to you myself. The recording ended with a final choked whisper. "Be safe, my son." "I love you." The cylinder stopped spinning. The hiss of static returned, then silence. Leo stood motionless, the disembodied voice still echoing in the vast chamber. The story recontextualized everything. His father wasn't a deadbeat. He wasn't a failure. He was a hero. He had sacrificed his life's work, his passion, his own son to protect him. The weight of that sacrifice settled on Leo's shoulders, a burden far heavier than the toolbox had ever been. He was not abandoned. He had been saved. And the unfinished invention on the workbench was not a symbol of failure. It was a symbol of his father's love. The revelation from the wax cylinders changed Leo from a student into a steward. The workshop was no longer just a place of discovery. It was a sanctuary to be protected, a legacy to be fulfilled. His father had given up everything to keep this place and Leo safe from the world. Now it was Leo's turn to protect it, He devoted himself to understanding the resonance tuner, the great unfinished work. It was the heart of his father's dream and the reason for his exile. To complete it, he felt, would be the ultimate vindication of Arthur's sacrifice. He spent weeks deciphering the final, cryptic set of blueprints, his mind stretching and growing as he grappled with the advanced concepts. He learned to use the workshop's delicate machinery, the lathe and the micro-solderer, his hands, once clumsy, now moving with a nascent confidence. He was no longer just reading his father's notes. He was continuing them, adding his own annotations in the margins, his handwriting a slightly shakier echo of Arthur's own. He was finishing the conversation. The work was slow, painstaking, and filled with frustrating setbacks, but he never wavered. He was fueled by a purpose so clear and bright, it felt like a star inside his chest. One day a tremor ran through the workshop. It wasn't a natural earthquake. It was a rhythmic, concussive thump. Thump, thump, that vibrated through the stone floor. It was the sound of the outside world, intrusive and violent. Alarmed, Leo raced to a side chamber his father had called the observatory. It contained a complex periscope system, an ingenious assembly of lenses and mirrors that allowed for a 360-degree view of the surrounding area, its exit points perfectly camouflaged as natural rock formations. He peered through the eyepiece, his heart pounding. On the far side of the river, a fleet of construction vehicles was assembled. Bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks, all bearing the same clean corporate logo, a stylized A inside a circle. Axiom Dynamics. His father's boogeymen were real. They were here. A group of men in hard hats and business suits were looking over blueprints, pointing towards the falls, towards him. They hadn't forgotten. They had just been waiting. A sign had been hammered into the ground nearby. Future site of the Axiom Dynamics Greylock Dam project. They weren't just here to find the workshop. They were here to demolish the entire cliff face. You are there, feeling the cold dread wash over him. The sanctuary is about to be violated, shattered by the very forces his father had sacrificed everything to escape. The rhythmic thumping of their survey equipment is a death knell for this secret world. You see the panic in his eyes, the frantic search for a solution. He is just a boy. They are a corporation, an army. How can he possibly stop them? He is his father's son, trapped in the same impossible dilemma. For a moment he considered running. He could pack the journal, a few of the smaller inventions, and disappear, just as his father had. But then he looked around the magnificent workshop, at the great orrery, at the chronovisor, at the workbench where the ghost of his father still smiled in the throes of creation. He couldn't abandon it. He wouldn't. This was his home. His father hadn't run. He had made a strategic retreat, leaving behind a seed of hope. Leo was that seed, and it was time for him to grow. A desperate plan began to form, a wild gamble born from his father's own genius. The resonance tuner was designed to draw power from the earth, but the blueprints included theoretical applications, dangerous ones his father had marked with stark warnings. With the right calibration, the device couldn't just draw power. It could also project it. It could create a focused, resonant frequency, a powerful, harmless vibration that could play havoc with sensitive electronic equipment. He could disrupt their machinery, their communications, without hurting anyone. He could become a ghost in their machine. He raced back to the central workbench. The final array of crystals still needed to be aligned and calibrated. It was a process his father's note said would take a week of careful microscopic adjustments. Looking through the periscope, he saw the first bulldozer roar to life. He didn't have a week, he had hours at best. He would have to do it live. He would have to trust in the knowledge he had absorbed, trust in his instincts, trust in the legacy flowing through his veins. He grabbed his father's tools, his hands no longer shaking. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but the purpose was hotter. He was no longer just protecting a place. He was fighting for his father's soul. He lowered the final power conduit into place. The resonance tuner hummed to life, a low, deep thrum that was the promise of a storm. The legacy was no longer dormant. It was ignited. The workshop filled with a sound unlike any other Leo had ever heard. It was not a single note, but a chord of immense depth and complexity, a sound that seemed to be the voice of the mountain itself. The resonance tuner was active. The central crystal array pulsed with a brilliant white light, and the air around it crackled with palpable energy. Leo stood at the control console, a massive bank of brass dials and copper switches that his father had built but never fully activated. His hands flew across the controls, his mind racing, translating his father's theoretical equations into practical, desperate action. Through the periscope, he could see the axiom bulldozers beginning to crawl towards the base of the falls. He took a deep breath and threw the main broadcasting switch. The hum of the tuner deepened, and the entire workshop vibrated, a low, powerful tremor that was felt, not heard. He watched the periscope image, his heart in his throat. The first bulldozer, its shovel raised to tear into the rock, suddenly sputtered. Its engine coughed, choked, and died. A plume of black smoke erupted from its exhaust. The driver looked around, confused, trying to restart the engine, but it was dead. Then the second bulldozer failed, its electronics flickering out. One by one, every piece of Axiom's machinery ground to a halt. Their radios filled with static. Their electronic surveying equipment went haywire. The men in suits were shouting, gesticulating wildly. They had no idea what was happening. To them, it was a freakish, inexplicable wave of mass equipment failure. They brought in mechanics and technicians, who were equally baffled. For 3 days, Leo kept up the resonant pulse, sleeping in shifts at the console, living on hydroponic greens and adrenaline. He was a ghost, a phantom force of nature, defending his home with invisible waves of energy. He was using his father's dream to protect his father's legacy. He had become the workshop's immune system, fighting off the infection of the outside world. On the 4th day, the Axiom team, defeated and bewildered, packed up. They loaded their dead machinery onto flatbed trucks and retreated, their grand demolition project thwarted by a mystery they could not solve. Leo watched through the periscope until the last truck had disappeared down the winding road. Then he cut the power to the tuner. The immense mountain-shaking hum faded, replaced by the familiar gentle whirring of the workshop at rest. Silence descended. He had done it. He had won. He slumped over the console, the tension and exhaustion of the last few days washing over him in a dizzying wave. He was safe. The workshop was safe. You are there in the victorious silence. You feel the profound relief, the deep, bone-weary satisfaction of the boy who faced down a giant and, against all odds, protected his home. You see him slide to the floor, his back against the cool metal of the console, a slow smile spreading across his face. It's not the triumphant smile of a warrior, but the quiet, contented smile of someone who has finally, truly found his place in the world. He is no longer just a visitor or a student. He is the guardian. In the weeks and months that followed, a new rhythm established itself. Leo was no longer just a keeper of the past. He became a creator of the future. He didn't just maintain his father's inventions. He began to improve them. He added new lenses to the chronovisor, allowing it to pick up fainter, older traces of memory. He began to build his own creations, small at first, his designs a blend of his father's elegant style and his own modern sensibilities. He was not just living in his father's shadow. He was adding his own light to it. One evening, he brought out the old rusty toolbox and set it on the central workbench. It looked ancient and primitive next to the wonders of the workshop, but he knew it was the most important object in the room. So it was the seed from which all of this had grown. He opened it, looking at the empty space where the blueprints and the journal had once been. He picked up a piece of his own drafting paper, a new design for a device that could translate the resonant frequencies of plants into audible music. He rolled it up, tied it with a piece of twine and placed it inside the toolbox. It was the first of his own creations to join the legacy. He no longer felt the need to prove himself. He no longer felt the ache of loneliness. In the silent, whirring symphony of the workshop, surrounded by the brilliant ghost of his father and the boundless potential of the future, he had found his family. He was Leo Morgan, the son of the inventor, the boy who had been mocked for carrying a rusty old box. Now he was the master of the workshop, a quiet genius hidden behind a waterfall, building wonders the world could not yet imagine. The toolbox had opened a door not just to his father's hidden workshop, but to his own destiny, and his work was just beginning.